Hey, what's going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. The Los Angeles Rams were one of the most potent offenses we've seen in recent memory, and we saw that offense led them all the way to the Super Bowl, where they eventually did lose to the New England Patriots. But all that firepower is back this year, though questions do linger in Los Angeles. So let's preview for 2019 fantasy football the Los Angeles Rams, and let's start with the biggest question. Todd Gurley, what is going on with this guy this year heading into this season? Boy, is this a head scratcher, because you know what? 2017 breakout, massive season for him. You know, put the naysayers aside after a disappointing 2016 season. And then all the way up until week 15 last year, it was basically the exact same thing. He was far and away the top fantasy running back. He was arguably the top weapon as a whole. If you had him on your roster, you were set, maybe even more so than Patrick Mahomes, just given the lack of depth at running back. But then, of course, in week 16, if you had Todd Gurley, you had to watch C.J. Anderson rumbling for 160-plus yards and a touchdown in your fantasy championship. So major disappointments. And then we didn't see anything get much better for Gurley in the playoffs. The Rams didn't really tell us what was going on, but obviously something was wrong there with Gurley's knee. A lot more smoke screens in the offseason. We haven't had any major clarity. There's been rumblings of arthritis in the knee. We don't really know what's going on with Todd Gurley's knee. But with this, I mean, we have to be at least somewhat conservative with Gurley for fantasy purposes. So you have to bump him down from elite territory. He is not in that tier right now. That being said, though, there is something to like about Todd Gurley for fantasy purposes. So let's pull this all together, because the team also did draft Darryl Henderson, and there are some out there who are viewing Henderson as maybe a replacement. I think we do need to know the player types, though, because Henderson doesn't necessarily have that profile as being a lead back, a feature back in the NFL. He's more of a complementary piece. You know, when you go back to last year, they had brought in John Kelly. Everybody loved John Kelly in the preseason. Remember that? And then during the regular season, he really didn't do anything. So Todd Gurley had to command roughly 90% of the running back touches in that backfield. That is an enormous number. 90% of the carries and catches for running backs on the Rams were going to Todd Gurley. That's unsustainable, and you know, any player out there is ultimately going to wear down with that sort of workload. So bringing in a guy to take a little bit of work off of Gurley's plate could be one of the reasons why they drafted Henderson. Maybe not as a replacement, but rather as a complementary piece, where Henderson gets maybe something like 8 to 10 touches per game, and now Gurley isn't 22 to 24 touches, but more like 18 to 20. You know, take a few more touches off of his plate per game than what we had last year. And that could actually end up helping Gurley. So if that would be the case, then you might end up getting Gurley at a half-decent value in the second round. All that being said, it's all about risk or reward in fantasy football. If you don't want to take on that risk, by all means, don't do it. I think the best place to look at Gurley, though, is round about the middle of the second round of a 12-team PPR. There is a lot of risk there, but there's no such thing as a safe bet in fantasy football. With that risk comes some major reward. Now, we have to also be viewing Darryl Henderson as a potential handcuff or premium handcuff, because he's going to have some independent value. And if Gurley goes down with an injury, then he could certainly step right in and get some touches, though we should note Malcolm Brown is still there as well, so he could possibly be in the mix for touches if Gurley got hurt. So I don't think Henderson is just a slam dunk Gurley replacement. And you're going to see he's a buzz name right now. He may go as early as the 6th or even 5th round on draft day. That's probably a little bit overvalued given his initial role in this offense. Of course, a lot of things can change between now and fantasy draft day. So you have to keep a close eye on this backfield for what the Rams ultimately plan to do with Todd Gurley. Very risky situation. I don't think there's as much risk for sure with Jared Goff. Last year, through the first 11 weeks of the season, he was the number 2 fantasy quarterback. He ultimately finishes as a top 10. They cooled off down the stretch. You know, it wasn't just Gurley. It was the Rams offense as a whole certainly cooled off. And there were a number of factors here. It wasn't Gurley alone. Cooper Kupp's injury, who I'll talk about in a minute, certainly also hurt the cause for Jared Goff. But the point of it is, we know he has top 10 fantasy potential at the position, and he's often not even being drafted that early. So you very likely, Goff could be one of those quarterbacks who you could target at a value and making sure, of course, you pair him up with another quarterback potentially as well for your stretch run if he happens to cool off again this year. But Jared Goff, a lot of juice, and it's really because of this trio of wide receivers. It's arguably the best trio of wideouts in the NFL. I don't know of any others who would be up in this territory. And let me be clear about this. I have all three of these receivers, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, and Cooper Kupp, ranked as top 25 guys in PPR at wide receiver. That is unheard of. And it's completely reasonable, too, in the same right. As crazy as it might sound, they could sustain production for all three of these receivers. When you look at what Woods was able to do last year, has that career year, 86 catches on the season, goes up over 1,200 yards, and he finishes the number 10 PPR wideout. Brandon Cooks, yet again, another top 15. He was 13th last year, another top 15 PPR season, year in, year out. The year before that, he was 15th. The year before that, he was 9th. This is what Brandon Cooks does. Now, if there is a knock on him, it was the 5 receiving touchdowns. Cooks doesn't get the ball a lot in the red zone, but we know he has big play potential on any given opportunity. And then Kupp, while we didn't get him for the whole season, he was 13th in fantasy scoring among wide receivers over the first 5 weeks of the season before the initial knee injury. Because remember, he had the initial knee injury, then he had the ACL after he came back from that initial injury. So you don't like to see that, but the injury was far enough in the rearview mirror that he's going to be good to go for this season. And what you love about Kupp's role in that offense is Sean McVay does a great job of putting Kupp in situations where he has major mismatches. So all three of these guys are viable. Cooks and Woods are almost, interchangeable, back-to-back, 50. In 100 drafts, I might take Cooks 50 times and Woods 50 times if I was faced with that decision. I have Kupp just a tick behind them. Doesn't maybe have as much upside as other guys, but he does have a big-time fantasy floor. So there's a lot to like about all of these receivers. And the thing about it is, we saw last year, the Rams can put points on the board, so we want to get a piece of this offense in some way, shape, or form. And, if you think Gurley is too risky, then the wide receivers is the better route to go. Get a piece of those wide receivers so you can get a piece of the points scored this season. Of course, Gerald Everett showed some signs of life last year. Tight end is a tricky position this year, and really Everett is far enough down the list that we're not looking at him as a guy who we're going to draft. And by the way, I would prefer him over Tyler Higbee, just given their roles in the offense. Higbee tends to be more of the inline, whereas Everett is more of the move. And if you have a 2 tight end setup with 2 guys who might be potentially viable, I tend to lean towards the move guy. That's the guy who has more fantasy potential. So that is Everett here. He's not a guy we're looking to draft, but he is a guy who may end up being a streamer at some points. We'll keep an eye on it. The problem, of course, is that there's so many targets that go to the wide receivers, so many targets that then also go to the backfield, that there just isn't a ton of meat on the bone for the tight end position in Los Angeles. Still like his upside, though, over the long term, you dynasty folks out there. You want to see where all the Los Angeles Rams land in our fantasy rankings? You can check those out and more at PFF.com.